What is up, my Shadowverse soldiers, and welcome back to another Shadowverse Evolve video. Alright soldiers, in today's video we're going to be doing this set 7 tier list. There's a lot of decks to cover, so let's go ahead and get into it. Alright, but before we start, I always want to go over the last tier list, so this is what the last tier list looked like. It's not too bad. We're definitely going to have to be doing some changing around and whatnot in compared to this tier list, because a lot of decks got some support, and definitely in set 8 we're going to have some new pictures for some new decks, because they're going to get some support too. Alright, but going ahead and getting us started, so the first deck we're going to be always talking about is Ramp Dragon. Ramp Dragon is not that bad, especially if you can get your ramps off, so we're just going to go ahead and put it in tier 2. And then moving on into academics, I don't believe we've done academics since we got that big buff. I can't remember so far, but I'm not going to lie, this deck is still not very good. I think we need 2 more sets. I think it's 2 more sets, and then we get some academic support. Let me know in the comments below if I'm wrong about that. But in 2 more sets, we should have some academic support that will make this deck a little bit better. All right, and next up, we're going to have Aggro Abyss. So this deck isn't too bad, especially if you can get the gas running. But the thing about getting the gas running in these aggro decks is that they really do fall off. So I'm definitely going to put this in tier 2 right next to Ramp Dragon, because you really need everything to go perfectly. I know we've got lots of new 1-drops and new 2-drops and stuff like that, but it's not something we should be looking forward to in set 7. Alrighty, next up we have Hand Control Disdain Abysscraft. So the one thing about these control decks is if you're able to stabilize, you can really destroy your opponent. So how can we stabilize with the new Abysscraft? Of course, we have Gensetsu and stuff like that. So I do want to put it in tier 1.5 if it can stabilize. If this deck can stabilize, I think it can really get there, just because you're always going to be taking cards out of your opponent's hand, and they're going to be using cards to put down on the field. And sometimes we don't really generate a lot of value in some of our turns. So if you're able to come back in a turn like that, I'd definitely give this deck 1.5. Alrighty, next up we have Vampires. So I haven't really seen Vampires all too often, but I know we did get a new legendary this upcoming set, but I haven't seen anybody play him yet. But I think it's a tier 3 deck. If we didn't put it in tier 3 or put it in Bring This Mess to Locals last time, I'd say this is definitely a tier 3 deck. Alright, and next up we have Earthright. So I chose Riley to be the representative of Earthright this time, just because Erasmus is just getting old and no one really uses them anymore. But I would solidly say that Earthright is slowly coming up, especially with that little Riley buff we just got. You know, she actually, all those abilities in one package is actually a lot to unpack. You get to deal 5 damage to something, she gets the +3 attack, she has Storm once you resurrect her from the grave, and you draw 2. I think that's pretty good. Alrighty, next up we have Discard Dragon. So I think this deck can really cook up with the new Natura thing, so I would definitely give it tier 2. And disclaimer, I feel like I'm going to put a lot of decks in tier 2 just because they can perform just for a pilot diff, if that's what I think that's the breakaway tier. Is tier 2 is, as long as you're a pilot, you know what the meta is. If your meta, or if the meta, excuse me, is like a matchup that you don't really can favor in, then you can just play the better deck that's a tier 1. But if it's something that's like, hey, I'm a pretty good pilot into this deck, I know all my matchups, I can really just win a lot, 75% of the meta, and really sneak away. So it's kind of like rogue tier. You can play these rogue tier decks and kind of get away with some wins, and then maybe even slipping into top 16 or something like that. So I think these are the decks you can probably take to a BCS and then do very well if you've done a lot of testing. But enough about that. I think Discard Dragon is actually pretty solid, especially if you can put any of the new Natura things in it and start spawning great trees. I think this card with Cook in it is just too good. Alright, so next is Ghost. Yeah. And then we have Dshift. So Dshift is alright. If you want to rock it with some regular spell chain and doing Dshift a different way, we already know what form of Dshift is going to be tier 1. Heavenly Aegis. So this is now a engine that cannot really be played too much. You can definitely work towards Heavenly Aegis, but it's not one of the cards that you really want to be focusing on. So I'm definitely going to give it tier 3. If anybody's keeping up with JP, then they know that this Uma deck is going to get better in the future. I definitely want to give Uma tier 3. I think there's situations where Uma can do well, but I don't think with the buff of the release of all the cards and everything, with the unrestricted, you can definitely find your Uma cards a lot faster. It's a very fun deck to play. I'd say if you really want to get someone into Shadowverse, I'd say use these collab decks like the Idol Masters and stuff like that. Those are perfect decks to get people into the game. Eventon Dragon. I really believe they keep releasing dragons for this, and I'm going to be honest with you, I've never played against this deck. I've never played against it a single time, and it feels like this awesome looking dragon got let down so hard. Alrighty, and then we have egg. So I don't believe I was an egg believer until I was in the All-in-One Gaming Generation Season 1, until I played a very good egg player. It's tier 1. It was tier 1. I played aggro against it. I couldn't build a board. I played control against it. They kept a board. They just swamped me. This deck is just really good. Especially if you can, like, I don't really know the true counterplay to this, besides the fact that they don't have a hand after they Humpty Dumpty. You have to flood the board with, 75% of your hand, or at least 25% of it to make it look a little scary. They do Humpty Dumpty, they lose their hand, but a good egg player is going to know how to play around that. And then on top of that, we got a new Fable Bunny card that really helps look for more cards. And I think there's another Evolve follower that's a Fable that lets you look for a Fable card from the top 4, I believe. I just know Fable got a bit of a buff from this set too, so I'm definitely going to keep it in tier 1. But next up, let's talk about Spellchain Rune. And I don't think we got any more Spellchain cards this recent set. I don't think there's anything interesting about it, but it's definitely something you don't want to be playing these days. Alrighty, and next up we have Fable Forest. So this deck got a bit of a buff with the Mad Hatter, so I'd definitely give it a solid tier 2. I don't know if you guys watched my video before where Rika was playing Fable Forest, and that Mad Hatter is actually pretty good. Like, I think this deck is a solid tier 2. Another one of my banes of existences. I thought this deck was going to be amazing, but I always find myself wanting to put new cards in it. I want to put new cards in it, and I just want to make it good. I want to make it decent. I know there's probably a chess player out there that is probably shaking in their bones right now that I'm putting it down here, but I think this deck just needs a little bit more. I think hopefully we get another card. I think Checkmate's going to be a card that we get in the future. Hopefully for English Shadowverse Evolve, we can get a better card for this deck. All right, next we have is Bolt Forest. So this deck is still pretty decent just because you do draw a lot of cards, but it does take time to set up, and I think Forestcraft is one of those decks. Well, at least this version of the decks, early game is just pretty bad, so you don't really want to play a deck like this because you're going to be drawing a whole bunch of cards, and then you need to use your cards to survive in the early game where you have to make sure you have the correct spells. It's kind of like playing Rune in a way, but you just draw more cards, and then your late game is you burning for X amount of damage for how many cards are in your hand. But we really don't want to be focusing on that because, Cassiopeia will be wiping the board and stuff. But I think it has tools to survive, but I don't think its late game is worth. Alright, so Leonidas Sword. So this deck definitely is going to be moving down. If I had it at 1.5 tier 2, Leonidas late game is not it, just because we have the new Machina things that are going to be removing the amulet off the field with ease. So Leonidas is definitely getting moved down while we have Machina Technolord stuff going on. Alright, and then we have Hero Sword. So the one thing about this deck is you have to hit one card. You have to hit the one Mach Knight. Once you hit your Mach Knight, you've got enough damage done in that your opponent is kind of like shaking a little bit. But I think when we get later on to the game, so when we get to those 5-6 play point plays, if you're a smart sword player, you can definitely get through. I definitely would give this tier 2. If you can get your Storm followers out on turn 3 or whenever you go for a heroic entry, you just have to be very careful when playing certain cards. Jabberwock, one of the cards that I saw in set 2 and was like, this can make some crazy shenanigans. A very interesting dragon card. But in terms of the meta, or in terms of the tier list right now, this is definitely a solid tier 3 deck. I would almost put it, if there was a range between Bring This Mess to Locals and tier 3, then I would definitely say so for sure. But I'm definitely going to put this deck in tier 3. Alright, in this next deck, we don't really need to talk too much about. We should already know that this isn't going to be doing too well. If we get some future support and this deck becomes gas, we'll move it up. But as of right now, I haven't seen this card played not once. Alrighty, and next up we have Alana's Prayer. So this deck, I don't know if I had it Bring This Mess to Locals or tier 3 last time, but with the new repair mode things, I think Alana's Prayer can probably cook a little bit. Just because we're always able to heal and we don't have to really rely on the Heavenly Repost follower that heals on your opponent's turn and then you have to do stuff on your turn. You just have to make sure you play a decent amount of followers that are able to, get a decent buff and then also protecting them at the same time. So, we're going to put a tier 3 because there's no protection for the followers that you're going to be buffing. So I think that's pretty solid. All right, and then we have Storm Haven. So every time they print a Storm card that's on Havencraft, I believe this deck just gets a buff just because there's more cards for Ruby Falcon to just proc off of. We got that new Robo Falcon, which is a good evolve card too, especially with healing and stuff like that. So I'd say this deck is tier 2. I don't think it's that bad, especially if you can get the gas going and your opponent doesn't have the answers. So playing a little bit low to the ground and then, going for Ruby Falcon and then, getting into that mid range and start swinging, I think it's still a pretty solid deck. All right, so the Heal Amulet deck, I know we got a 5-cost spell card that allows you to play cards. I don't know if that was this set or the last set, but I haven't seen this around too much. It's an interesting deck. I just think we need a little more. We just need a little more to get it into that push into tier 2 because, I mean, we did get Lapis, but I don't think Lapis is really going to help because you do want to focus on Instatute Seraph in that deck. And you can get 2 prayer counters and boost up the game plan a little bit faster, but when you do that, both those things, both Lapis and the Instatute Seraph, you need that extra turn. You need that extra turn, and sometimes when they know that you go for that big play and you need that extra turn, that's usually the time where they can get some good damage in, and the Instatute Seraph buff isn't really going to help you too much. Alright, and next up we have Nure Abyss. So, Ektar is definitely still a good boss monster to put you out bodies, and then getting to the Necrocharge 20, that doesn't sound realistic, but having the Necrocharge 10 can really happen a little quicker than usual just because we have that new quick spell to remove a 3-cost follower, and then you bury the top card, so that really gets 2 cards into your cemetery easily. So I think this is tier 2, especially for the fact that tier 2 is really the pilot focused. Certain matchups, I feel like this would definitely be dead in the water, but if you're able to get your game plan going, I think tier 2 is a solid spot for this deck. Alrighty, next we have PDK. So I haven't seen this card played since set 4, set 5. This deck was pretty interesting. I liked the build that Tristan had when we had on the channel earlier. I don't know if you guys have seen that video, but it was an amazing build that topped BCS. I would say that this deck has fallen off, though. There are new Dragoncraft followers. Let's not sit here and act like there aren't a bunch of Dragoncraft followers that we can play. But it's just what this deck wants to do. It's a 5-cost follower that you play for 3. In ramp, you're going to be ramping, and then, the 3-cost follower isn't too bad. But you have to make sure your opponent has bodies on the field just to make sure they're able to burn. And if you are swinging at them with either a Forte or something like that, then you need to pay attention to the fact that they might be playing a card that'll definitely trade into Forte, and they'll make sure they have nothing on the field so you can't proc it. Alright, in this next deck, I don't even remember this guy's name. I don't even remember his name. I'm sorry the text is so small and you can't see what he says, but I don't even remember this guy's name. I think his name's Gawain, but goodness gracious. Talk about printing a legendary and then not having any support for it. Alrighty, next up we have Giant Chimera. So I don't know how everyone else personally feels about Giant Chimera, but I still love this cards and this deck's game plan. You're milling your own deck, you're throwing your hand away, you're using Daria to just burn your opponent. And the fact that there's no interaction in between all of that just makes it amazing. Now, getting there is probably the hard part. You're going to be using a whole bunch of stuff to remove and whatnot, but using your Heimlings and not even caring what you mill, just as long as you don't mill your Giant Chimera and using Gold Ring or whatever you need to make sure you have them at the bottom of your deck and stuff like that, I think this deck is pretty solid. You just have to make sure you survive the early game because that's where this deck is the weakest, but if you're able to burn them, I think it's pretty solid. Meanwhile, I'm, glazing this deck and I didn't place it somewhere, but I am going to put it in tier 3 just because it's probably the 4th best rune deck. If we had to rank them, I would say Earthright is just right on top of this. If this deck had a little more support or something to make it just maybe 1 turn faster, I think this deck would be maybe tier 2, tier 1.5. Alright, next up we have King Elephant. So if we put Silverbolt in tier 3, I haven't really seen King Elephant played too much just because any version of Forestcraft is going to be played in the form of maybe fairies or just something else that's not these 2 decks. So I would say this is definitely tier 3. Haven't seen it too much. I think it's still a fun deck. It's still one of those fun. I think all the decks in tier 3 are just maybe pet decks that you really enjoy that you don't want to let go of. But they're not something you can really take too seriously, while tier 2 is just, I take this deck a little seriously. I could take it to a BCS if I know my matchups I can top. All right, and then we have Mars. So I'm gonna put this deck in tier 2. I know Mars isn't played too much, but I think as long as we keep getting officer cards, this deck gets better. Now, of course, we're going to want to play the decks that have the solid game plan and whatnot, but if we can master Mars, I think this is a solid tier 2 deck. If we had a tier 2.5 or something like that, that was just like, hey, you know, this card keeps getting support, it's going to be good. And that's what I always say, is if they keep printing support, eventually the deck will get good. Alrighty, next up we have Disdain Dragon. So we slept on this deck on the last tier list, but we won't this time. Set 8, we are getting a new piece of support for the deck, which is going to be very interesting to look into. I don't know how often it's going to come up, but having a spell card that's going to trigger as long as you have your Galmi on the field is pretty nice. I don't want to give this deck tier 2 though. I don't want to give it tier 2. Like, I'm on the fence about it, because if you know your matchup for Disdain, because the deck draws, the deck does damage, but, you know, what you're doing in the early game, you know, using your Phylene and whatnot, the Frost Dragons, I'm going to put it in tier 3 for right now. I know I'm, like, kind of on the edge of, like, putting it in tier 2, but I'm going to put it in tier 3. I want everyone to act low-key flame me in the comments of my perspective on Shadowverse Evolved, but I didn't give the deck credit last time. The deck won a tournament from me not understanding like how good this deck really was. But I think as we're like this far into the meta now, I think this deck is actually tier 3. All right, next we have Lust Abyss. So I haven't seen this deck play too much since it came out. I really want to put it in Bring This Mess to Locals. Yeah, I'm going to put it in Bring This Mess to Locals. It's an aggro deck. Don't get me wrong. It's an Abyss aggro deck, but if you're just putting the straight engine in there, I think it's pretty bad. If you put all the good, you know, Abysscraft cards, I'd say solid tier 3, but I think just Lust as a deck, I'm just gonna put in and Bring This to Locals. All right, Heavenly Repose. So I haven't seen this deck played at all either, but I am gonna put in a solid tier 3 just because it is like solid control. The early game, I don't know what you can do to survive. I know there's like, we got the boost kicker or whatnot, the guy that's gonna wipe the board for however many exploit points that you have, and that's nice and everything. But I think solid tier 3 is where it needs to be. Alrighty, and this next deck that we're going to talk about, Fable Forest, is something that we need to watch out for in set 8. This deck is going to go absolutely wild with the amount of support it's going to get. So I'm gonna put this deck and Bring This Mess to Locals right now. But as of February 7th, oh yeah, this deck is going crazy. Tier 1, tier 1.5. And next up we have Thief Sword. I think this is one of those decks where it's still tier 2. A lot of sword decks, I believe, belong in tier 2, especially if they're not amulet focused and they can survive the mono Machina gameplay. If you can match their freak in terms of aggro, I think this deck is pretty solid. So I'm gonna give it tier 2, and we're also probably I think we're getting some support for a next set as well. So I think this deck is still pretty solid and can probably be moved up to 1.5. I'd probably put it at the top of tier 2 of anything out of all these decks that are in tier 2 right now. I'd probably put it at the top. Alrighty, and then we have Rayo, so mages. So we're going to get another card in set 8 that's going to go with Rayo 2. Will this make the deck any better? I'm not sure. As long as mages are going to get supported, or every time they print a new mage card, then, you know, as long as we're able to play them earlier and these mages can do something very impactful whenever they're played, I think the deck will get better. But as of right now, it seems pretty weird that you play Rayo and then sometimes you can't even evolve him because he's like a 9 cost play. But when we do get our new spell card that's going to give us that 1 evolution point when we do play our Rayo, and as long as that card's in the cemetery, this deck will probably get moved up into tier 2, or at least played a little bit more. Alright, and then we have Medusa, so Gorgons and Serpents. Haven't seen this deck played, so I'm assuming that this is a low tier level deck. Gorgons does have a pretty interesting spell card, and I like what Medusa wants to do, and it has some pretty solid removal with its Serpents too, but I think this deck just doesn't have the support that it needs. But when Medusa gets moved over into the next set, Rune, by the way, spoiler if you guys are looking forward to it, I'm very interested to see what she's going to be doing in the Rune class. And speaking of Rune class, we have Lenna, so I'm going to put her in 1.5. She gets a lot of support next set. She's not going to be tier 1 or anything, but I think this deck can hang. It can hang as long as you're able to remove stuff. And with Maisha, I think with Maisha, this deck is actually pretty solid. So I'm going to put Lyshen at tier 1.5. I might be a little biased. You can bite me, but I think this deck can really hang. Now, when we get our next bit of support and we're able to at least play Lyshenna and then play one of the, cards in the back at least once, I think that'll really help out. Oh Romeo, where art thou, Romeo? So we have Romeo and Juliet sword, or I guess Princess sword, whatever you want to call this deck. This deck is pretty cool. I like what it does, and it's able to play out a pretty storm body, but I'm gonna put it and bring this mess to locals just because, what Sword wants to do right now is be on Balion, and it's not too bad. That's not a bad thing. We have Miss Delina. She's also a princess too, so there's that too. So I still want to put it at bring this mess to locals, because if you're gonna be rocking Juliet, you have to rock Romeo, and that means you have to have both a full playset in your deck, which isn't too crazy. Don't get me wrong, it's not too crazy, but I think it's just a locals levels deck. And then Gillan. So every time we get a new neutral card, I believe this deck just gets a little bit better. So as far as where I want to place it, I probably want to put it in tier 3. I think the Cravings package is nice, and you're able to remove a body and then get a huge heal, which is big. But I think the only class you can really run this in to really focus on a full neutral deck is really Dragon, just so you can get ahead on the game plan of what you want to do. So I'd say this would probably be good in Dragon. All right, and then we have Pelt Warriors. So I do like what some of the Pelt Warriors do. Aragavi is still a pretty nice card, especially if you have that Sanguine active. I think in terms of the deck, I think it's pretty cool. The cards are nice. But as far as what it's doing like right now, I don't think the deck's just doing too well. All right, so I don't know what I said about Courtly Dance in the last video, but I really just realized that Courtly Dance is kind of like, it can be put in any archetype of sword. Like, if you're rocking any sword deck, you can rock this card. So I really didn't have like a specific place to put Courtly Dance in, like what deck I was talking about. So I'm gonna put Courtly Dance in tier 3. Probably would put it in tier 2 if you have like a more like conscious game plan of what you're doing. Like, you can put Courtly Dance and like Hero Sword, or you can put Courtly Dance and, Leonidas. But as of right now, those cards that you do play, unless they have Storm, they're not really doing anything, and board wipes are just becoming normal for every class. So every class that gets a board wipe, this card just gets a little worse. All right, and then we have Garyu Dragons. So I like what the deck wants to do. I like what this deck wants to do, but I think this is a locals levels deck just because you're able to evolve him, and he does become a 5-cost follower from you playing like 7 play points for him, and then all your Dragoncraft followers do get ward. But as soon as he's removed, like, it's not like the ward sticks. It would be different if it said, hey, if a Dragoncraft player was, or a Dragoncraft follower was played while this card is on the field, it gains ward. That's different than, as long as this card's out on the field, all your Dragoncraft followers have ward, like, no. So we're gonna put it at locals, and I think that's where it's a good place to be. All right, and then we have Hunter Forest. So there's a difference in a deck being popular and a deck being very solid and very good. So Hunter Forest has a lot of things going for it, especially if you can just like every turn play a hunter. Your opponent's gonna have to deal with your hunters, or they're gonna have to take the damage. So that fills up the 3 cards in Cemetery very easily. So I'd say this deck is pretty solid. I'd put it in tier 2. Now, as far as what I mean in tier 2 for Hunter Forest, I'm not sure if this deck could top. I don't think this deck could top, but I think like you could definitely win. Like if there was like a huge webcam tournament, I think this is one of the decks that you wouldn't be prepared for, and you could definitely like top for it. Now, I know we don't have major webcam tournaments or anything Bushiroad official or anything, but I think this deck is one of those decks where, hey, if you're going to like maybe a shop challenge or something like that, and no one's really expecting this deck to be there, and you're one of the outliers that are like, hey, you're new to the place, I've never seen you, you play Hunter Forest, your opponent may or may not know what to do, they can't stabilize, and you have like a good late game. Even though probably with their new set 7 deck, they're probably gonna have a better late game, I still think it's a solid deck with Storm. And also Mark of the Six is just a really good card. Alrighty, and then we have Fairy Forest. So I think this deck is still tier 1, but there are the opportunities where it doesn't perform. So I do want to give it tier 1.5, but with Cynthia coming out, replacing our Spinaria, I think tier 1 is like pretty solid for this deck. So, you know, you're just going to be putting out these fairies and they're going to have Storm and they're going to have extra attack too. So, and then they're gaining attack from Blessed Fairy Dancer, so they're going to be even bigger, and then Amataz is still relevant too. So I'm definitely going to give this card, or this deck, excuse me, tier 1. Oh, the Karula Arts, the mastery of the Karula Arts. Now, the idea of this deck was very interesting. Having extra play points at the end of your turn and then using spell cards on your opponent's turn, or, you know, getting effects at the end of your turn is just so neat. But I don't know what this deck really does. I don't know like how impactful it is. Like, there's no huge storm. I mean, we do have interesting storm cards that we can put in the deck, don't get me wrong, but I just don't think it's there. All right, and Wilbert. So I think this is probably like, if you're not rocking anything from set 7, if you're playing a Haven deck, I think this is the Haven deck to play, just because you can get 2 bodies in one. And this card paired up with Lapis, and then this card also paired up with Holy Lancer is just too good. So I'm gonna put this deck in tier 2. I'm pretty sure I put this deck pretty low, but that's because we didn't have any like ward followers like that were too interesting. But now we have removal, we have a good way to heal, we get prayer counter, excuse me, on Lapis. She's gonna draw us X amount of cards if she's removed. If she's removed first, you're gonna be burning 1 card through Wilbert, so you're getting, you know, the best of both worlds there, with healing and burn, and then drawing. All right, and then I guess we have the best rune deck. We lost Curse Crafter, and that's okay. We just fill in other spots for Curse Crafter, but it's still Kuon. People say turn 7 is where Kuon's going to be doing its thing, but I don't think the deck is that fast. Like, there's no way you're playing Rune, like paying attention to your opponent's game plan, making sure you're surviving, and then also feeling enough for Kuon by turn 7. There's no way that's happening. And round me a sword. I don't know where this deck went. This is the interesting. I like what Round Me does. If you're using a lot of Evo points to evolve your followers, I think, you know, Kagemitsu and Round Me a Sword is like a pretty decent deck, but I don't know where this deck went. I would definitely put Ralmia in one of my decks because she seems pretty cool, but I'd say that she's probably tier 3. I feel like I'm gonna get a lot of like hashback on some of the decks that are in tier 3, but I think Ralmia Sword is one of those decks that does deserve tier 2, but we just need a lot more evolved sword followers. All right, and now we have Yokai Abyss. So this deck is like very nasty if you can survive to get into Gensetsu. And then after that, if you're able to stabilize 2 Gensetsus on the field and then, you know, having a lot of storm damage, this deck can really get out of hand. So I'm going to put it in tier 2. Gensetsu is still a very good card if you need to stall for 1 more turn and have like a huge board of foxes. And if they can't remove the Gensetsu because she has such a high defense on her evolved side, then you're sitting pretty good if you're able to play another Gensetsu and then swing with your first one. All right, now we're gonna get into the Idol Master decks. So we're probably gonna put a lot of these in different tiers just because most of these decks performed at different levels. So I think the mid-range, the mid-range Passion, I'd probably put at tier 2, probably 1.5. If you can survive that early game, it feels good, but making sure you have those bodies on field and Mio just spamming the board out and looking at top 3, putting whatever follower that you want. If you hit those high bodies, it feels good. So it's kind of like gambling. You get those 3 bodies on the board, you engage so you can play Mio. Mio's going to play your last card, which is both going to get bounced back to your hand. That's fine. But if you hit that high body that has Storm and that's going to blow up the entire board, I think you're hitting like the gambling game good. But moving on into cute, I want to give this deck tier 3. I think the deck is cute. No pun intended. The deck is cute. You're going to be stalling. You're going to give your opponent a headache, and you're either going to make them quit by healing as much and being annoying as you can, or your opponent's going to storm you out. But how often does that game plan happen? I don't think it happens too much, but I think tier 3 is a solid place to put the cute deck. Every time I look at this deck, I get shivers down my spine, just because this deck does a lot too fast. I want to give this deck tier 1. There are chances when you can get gassed out. There are chances when you don't hit anything, but I think that's just what happens when you play the aggro game. I would still give it tier 1 because it can still do a lot of damage very quickly. and the fact that it doesn't use resources from your hand. You're using resources from your hand to go look for your deck to play a card from your deck. All right, and then we have Lydia Stoneclaw. So the forest deck that manages to make it through. So if you have Natirian Great Trees, you're going to be healing 3 from that early game. This deck has a little bit of everything, I'm not gonna lie to you. So I'd put it in tier 1 as of set 7. The lowest I would put this is tier 1.5. If you really can get that huge damage turn where you can play all your cards out, your opponent can't interact. If your opponent builds some sort of field as you're going for this Lydia turn, then they're going to lose it because you should have this card and the spell card that's going to be blowing everything up for her, however much attack that she has. So I think this deck is tier 1. Alrighty, next up we have Natura Sword. So this is an interesting deck. I would already give this deck tier 1. You've seen the results that this deck does. People compared it to Egg, but I think this deck has like a better late game than Egg. Like Egg kind of like does really well in the mid game, where it's gonna blow up your board and do stuff with Tin Soldier and Alice and stuff like that with the new support that they got, of course. But I think this deck really just excels in the late game. Like they have lots of removal. You play your Baleon. If you get your Baleon removal card from the top 4 from the Baleon Evolve, you're sitting pretty nice because you have a nice just destroy follower card that's free. And then you have Princess Strike, which is a card that's like snipe for sword. And I really do want to sit down and kind of talk about like the sword problem. So, or I guess the problem that we're having in the crafts in general, which, you know, no one really talks about, is that every deck is getting like some sort of like new base card. And let me explain what I mean when I say that. All right, so I don't know if any of you know this or have paid attention to any of the mechanics of the old sword cards, was that if you had X amount of cards on the board, you would be doing X amount of damage to either a single card or to the board. That either being like, you know, Cyclone Blade or, you know, Unbridled Fury. I know these are old cards and, you know, I have to get with the times, old man, that's fine and everything. But Sword is just getting cards like Princess Strike. Like Sword should not be having its own cards that are like snipe. Like they should be outsourcing for neutral cards, because I feel like that's how it should go. Now, if that's kind of hot takey, I'm sorry, but it's just how I think about it. Like Baleon is definitely a good deck. I love what Baleon does. I like how it kind of like does the little top 4 thing and gets 2 cards into your EX area like Egg does. I like how Sword's doing that. I like what it does. I like how he has Ward, and I like the Natirian buff things. But when Sword starts doing like spellcrafting things where, hey, you know, I'm also playing an aggro deck against the Sword deck, now Sword has an answer to my earlier game aggression, and they're not using Angelic Snipe. Or just like an example, I hit Baleon and then I evolve and then I'm able to get Princess Strike. Princess Strike is going to sit in my EX area and threaten 2 damage on one of my followers the entire game if I either A, don't play anything, or 2, I'm playing low to the ground and I know my follower is going to get got. But enough about my sword rant. I think the deck is solid, very good, tier 1 as the end of set 7. Now going into set 8, I believe everyone's going to be running to our new friendly forest deck, which is going to be the new version of aggro. But I think that as of set 7, this is a tier 1 deck. And then we have Makin Aoon. I never talked about this in any of the Inverse Academy episodes, and I really don't want to. This deck, I played it and I was just like, I didn't have my Techno Lords, and I know that's my fault, but I feel like the deck really just lacked. I mean, once you get into the turn 7 and you had to wait until the end of your turn to buff all your followers. And then there are no followers that have like Storm or anything, so you have to like wait a turn. I just feel like that kills a lot of like Rune's game plan, is that you have to wait a turn, and you know, Rune really wants to specify in using spells to either burn you away or to steal an extra turn from you, and when this deck is not doing either of those things, it's kind of lackluster. Now don't get me wrong, Technolord is a good card, but I still think that this is like a solid tier 3 deck, just because Baphomet is nice and you can play whatever cards that you get, but you know, there's also a chance that you could miss. And when you miss, when you play Baphomet, it's like, what the hell did I just spend my turn doing? Alright, next up we have Nure Dragon. So this deck is actually pretty solid. I'd give it tier 2, probably tier 1.5 if you're able to, you know, if you run your deck with Disdain or any of the discard package, excuse me, I think this deck is actually pretty solid. And here's what I mean by discard package. If you're running the Dracomancer's Rights in this deck just burns for a lot. You get 1 dragon or you get one Natirian Great Tree on your field. And as soon as you activate that thing and you have both the Shadow's Corrosion in your EX area and the discard, you've set, I mean, granted, it does take a lot to set up, but with Dragon, we're ramping at the same time too. So does it really take a lot to set up? I know we don't have a huge hand size Ash Dragon already, and then using both the discard package and the Nure Dragon stuff really does hurt, but you're going to be trading away cards from your hand to do extra damage in Shadow's Corrosion, and you're also going to be doing damage to Dracomancer's Rites. So I think this deck is pretty solid. Oh, mono. So I feel like we shouldn't need to talk about this deck too much. This deck is tier 1. If you're, I just don't know what stops this deck on their turn besides like maybe Rune. And once you get to that big mono turn, there's not much interaction. And once you get into that, once you get that spell card, that Nicola spell card is nasty, I tell you. Like dealing 4 damage? Dealing 4 damage? Like, oh, this is so crazy. Like that's so crazy for 2. I know Surefire Bullet is one of those cards that, you know, does that, but there's a condition for that. No, it's just a straight up deal 2 or deal 4, spend 2. Like, insane. All right, my thing messed up, but we are doing Lemonia Haven, and I'm definitely gonna give this deck tier 2. I haven't seen this deck played too often, but we did have a nice, decent talk about it in our last video. It has some pretty good removal. I think the storm damage in it is pretty nice. Just threatening the fact that you can always wipe the board and your opponent has to be scared of that. So they probably may either play around it. Now, the deck can do bad, don't get me wrong. Like, this is why it's in tier 2. The deck has lots of potential to be bad. But when it does do well, it feels pretty good. Alrighty, and this is the full tier list. So I know tier 1.5 is really lacking in terms of cards. I probably would put more decks in tier 1.5, it's just I haven't seen a lot of play through them. It's a little hard to get some, you know, good infographics on it when there isn't too much Shadowverse play. But from what I've seen in the collection of cards that are out, you can get a good basis of what's going on in the meta and stuff like that. And it's like, hey, tier 1.5, can these decks survive? I think, you know, I did a decent amount of explaining for Lenna to be able to make it just because, you know, Purgation Blade's a thing. And Maisha package really does just help out with that secondary engine. But, you know, set 8, we probably, hopefully the deck will just get a little bit better. But I think everything checks out. Now, if you disagree with me, let me know down in the comments below, and I can personally like fight you in the comments. You might be right, but you know, there's nothing wrong with having a little conversation about how we do these things. But thank you guys for watching. I appreciate you being here. In the future, I actually want to do this on stream, so I was going to put a poll out to want to do this like maybe on Friday and do a tier list on this Friday, but I have to get looking forward to other things for the channel, so I just went ahead and did it. So I'm sorry I did it without you guys, but hopefully in the future, maybe, you know, the end of set 8, we can do a set 8 tier list and that's streamed and everybody can give their input, and you guys can just fuss at me in the comments and be like, hey, that's the wrong tier for this card or whatnot. But thank you guys for watching. I appreciate all of you. Make sure you're safe in whatever you do tonight and safe what we do for the rest of the year. I will see you in the next one. Bye.
Yeah. TRINN. Just to get you away. What I got to do.